Welcome back to Wolfale Tales, and if you're new here, welcome to a world where supernatural romance knows no bounds. I am absolutely thrilled to have you join us today, because we have something truly extraordinary waiting for you. First, I want to give a massive thank you to everyone who engaged with our last video. Your comments, your theories about what would happen next, your heart emojis flooding the comment section. You have no idea how much that means to me. Your feedback and excitement fuel these stories, and I read every single comment. You are the reason this channel exists. And speaking of our amazing community, I want to send special love to our incredible subscribers watching from the United States, Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom, and literally all corners of our beautiful world. You've built this into a truly global pack, and I'm so grateful for each and every one of you. Today's featured story. He was a cursed alpha who couldn't have children until he had a one-night stand with a mysterious human. Are you ready for a tale that will completely consume you? This is the CEO's secret when love transcends reality, and I promise you, by the end of this story, you'll believe that true love really can conquer everything. Let's dive in, my beautiful pack. Your heart is about to be completely captured. Now, let our story begin. Elena Moreau had always believed that the worst thing that could happen during a late night at the office was spilling coffee on important documents. She was wrong, catastrophically, life-alteringly wrong. The worst thing was watching your devastatingly attractive CEO tear out a man's throat with his bare hands. Or rather, with claws that definitely hadn't been there 30 seconds earlier when she'd knocked on his office door to deliver the quarterly reports he'd requested. Now she stood frozen in the doorway of Dominic Blackthorne's executive suite, her body refusing to process what her eyes had just witnessed. The man who'd been sitting across from her boss, a stranger in an expensive suit, who'd radiated an unsettling energy that made her skin crawl, was now sprawled across the imported Italian marble floor in a spreading pool of crimson that looked almost black under the ambient lighting. And Dominic was crouched over the body like some predator from her darkest fantasies. His perfectly tailored Armani suit torn at the shoulders, his usually immaculate dark hair falling across his forehead in wild strands. His hands, those elegant hands that signed million-dollar contracts and made her stomach flutter when he passed her files, were stained with blood up to his wrists. But it was his eyes that stole her breath. Those steel-gray eyes that had haunted her dreams for the past 6 months of her internship were now molten gold, glowing with an otherworldly light that should have been impossible. They fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel like prey, and yet instead of terror, she felt something else entirely: safety. The thought was so absurd it made her dizzy. Here was a man who had just committed what could only be described as a savage murder, and her first instinct wasn't to run or scream or call the police. It was to step closer, to smooth that disheveled hair back from his forehead, to ask if he was hurt. What the hell was wrong with her? Elena. Her name on his lips was a low rumble, rougher than she'd ever heard it, layered with something primal that sent shivers racing down her spine. He rose slowly from his crouch, and she could see the effort it took him to control his movements, to appear human when everything about him screamed otherwise. She tried to speak, tried to ask the 1,000 questions crowding her mind, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. Mr. Blackthorne, what? Don't. The single word cracked like a whip, and she watched in fascination as his eyes flickered between that impossible gold and their normal gray. Don't ask questions you're not ready to hear the answers to. But Elena had never been good at following directions, especially when her curiosity was aroused. It was a trait that had gotten her into trouble more times than she could count, from sneaking into her grandmother's attic as a child to chase whispered stories about things that went bump in the night, to staying late at the office to organize files that weren't her responsibility just because she'd caught glimpses of correspondence that didn't quite make sense. Like the letter she'd seen last week addressed to something called the Shadow Creek Pack, or the monthly transfers to an organization listed only as the Council. Details that had niggled at the back of her mind, creating a picture she couldn't quite see but somehow felt was important. Now, staring at the man who'd occupied her thoughts and fantasies for months, she was beginning to understand that those details weren't random at all. They were pieces of a puzzle that was far more dangerous and incredible than she'd ever imagined. The man on the floor, she managed, her voice steadier now, despite the tremor in her hands. He wasn't human, was he? Dominic's jaw clenched and she watched muscles ripple beneath his torn shirt as he fought some internal battle. What makes you say that? His teeth. The memory came rushing back, sharp and clear, despite the surreal nature of what she'd witnessed. When he smiled at you before you killed him. His teeth were wrong. Too sharp, too long. She swallowed hard, her grandmother's pendant burning against her throat, where she'd unconsciously started tracing its Celtic knots. And his eyes. They reflected the light like an animal's. Something flickered across Dominic's face, surprise perhaps, or recognition. He took a step toward her, and she noticed how he moved with predatory grace, placing each foot with careful precision, as if he was stalking prey, or trying very hard not to. You saw that? It wasn't a question. His voice had dropped to that dangerous whisper she'd heard him use once on a phone call that had made everyone in the outer office suddenly find urgent tasks to occupy their attention. Most humans can't. They see what their minds can accept and filter out the rest. Most humans. The phrase sent another shiver through her, this one edged with fear instead of the strange attraction that had been clouding her judgment. Most humans, she repeated slowly. But not all. No, he said. And now he was close enough that she could smell him, expensive cologne layered over something wild and masculine that made her mouth water despite the circumstances. Not all. The scent triggered something deep in her mind, a memory of her grandmother's voice, whispering stories in fractured English and lilting French about les créatures de la nuit and the rare few who could see them truly. Stories Elena had dismissed as fairy tales, meant to keep a lonely child entertained during long summer visits to the cottage in the Louisiana bayou. But Grandmare's stories had always felt more like warnings than entertainment. And now, staring into Dominic Blackthorne's otherworldly eyes, Elena was beginning to understand why. "What are you?" she whispered, and the question hung between them like a challenge. For a long moment he said nothing. Then his lips curved in a smile that was anything but human, revealing teeth that were just a little too sharp, just a little too white. The better question, Elena, is what are you? Before she could process what he meant, the world around her seemed to shift. It started as a tingling behind her eyes, like the beginnings of a migraine. But instead of pain came an explosion of light and sensation that stole her breath. Suddenly, she could see everything. Golden threads of light stretched through the air like spider webs, connecting every living thing in ways that defied physics and logic. Some threads pulsed with vibrant energy, others flickered weakly, and a few, like the one connecting her to Dominic, blazed with an intensity that made her gasp. She could see his true nature now, overlaid on his human form like a double exposure. The wolf that lived beneath his skin, massive and midnight black, with eyes that burned like molten amber. But more than that, she could see the thread that bound them together, thick as a rope and glowing with power that seemed to pulse in rhythm with their heartbeats. "Oh God," she breathed, raising a trembling hand to her temple as the visions threatened to overwhelm her. "What's happening to me? Your gift is awakening." Dominic's voice seemed to come from very far away, muffled by the roar of supernatural energy flooding her senses. I'd prayed it would stay dormant, that you could live a normal life, never knowing what you truly are. And what am I?" The question came out as a sob, tears streaming down her cheeks as she struggled to process the impossible things she was seeing. Through the golden threads, she could sense other presences in the building. Things that definitely weren't human, moving through the shadows with purposes she couldn't understand. "You're a soul seer," he said, and his voice was gentle now, stripped of its earlier edge. "One of the rarest gifts in the supernatural world. You can see the connections between all living things, the bonds that tie us together, the relationships that transcend death itself." She blinked hard, trying to clear the visions, but they only intensified. The golden thread connecting her to Dominic pulsed brighter, and with it came a flood of emotion that wasn't her own. Longing, desperate, aching longing that had been building for months. Fear, not of her, but for her. And underneath it all, a bone-deep certainty that finding her had changed everything. "You've been watching me," she whispered, the knowledge flowing through their connection like water. "Not just as my boss. You've been hunting me, protecting you." The correction came swift and fierce. "From the moment you walked into my building, I knew what you were, what you could become. And I knew that if the wrong people discovered your gift..." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Through their bond, she could feel his terror, not for himself, but for her. Images flashed through her mind that belonged to him. Supernatural beings with cold eyes and cruel smiles, speaking of experiments and extractions. A governing body called the Council that viewed soul seers as either useful tools or dangerous threats. And somewhere in those visions she caught glimpses of her parents. Her mother's face twisted with fear as shadowy figures surrounded their car on a rain-slicked highway. Her father's desperate attempt to shield his wife and daughter from attackers who moved too fast to be human. "They killed them," she gasped, the truth hitting her like a physical blow. "My parents, they were murdered because of what I am." Dominic's face went stone cold, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to absolute command. Not because of what you are, because of what they feared you might become. His eyes blazed gold again. They'll never touch you. I swear it on my life, Elena. I'll burn this world to ash before I let them hurt you. The vehemence in his voice should have frightened her. Instead, it sent heat spiraling through her belly, a response so inappropriate to their circumstances that it made her cheeks burn. What kind of person got turned on by death threats and supernatural revelations? Apparently, the kind of person who'd been having increasingly vivid dreams about her boss for the past 6 months. Dreams that always ended with her waking up aching and empty, reaching for something she couldn't name. Now she had a name for it. Mate bond. The knowledge flowed through their connection without words, an understanding that bypassed rational thought and settled into her bones like it had always belonged there. "This is insane," she whispered, but even as she said it, she could feel herself stepping closer to him instead of backing away. 20 minutes ago, my biggest concern was whether I'd remembered to save the Morrison account files. Now you're telling me I'm some kind of supernatural, witch? Not a witch. His hand rose as if to touch her face, then stopped inches from her skin. She could feel the heat radiating from his palm, could see the way his fingers trembled with the effort not to close that final distance. Something far rarer, far more precious, and far more dangerous, she guessed, reading the truth in his expression. Yes, the word was barely a breath. The council has laws about witnesses to supernatural violence. Humans who see too much are given 3 choices: join us, bond with one of us, or die, she finished, surprised by how calm she sounded. Maybe shock was finally setting in, buffering her from the full impact of what he was telling her. "How long do I have?" 72 hours from the moment you witnessed my feeding. His mouth twisted on the word, self-loathing clear in every line of his face. "They'll send a cleaner. Someone whose job is to make problems like this disappear quietly. And you?" She forced herself to ask the question, even though part of her already knew the answer. "What's your job in all this?" His smile was sharp as a blade and twice as dangerous. "I'm the alpha of the Shadow Creek pack. My job is to protect what's mine." The possessiveness in his voice sent another shiver through her, but this time she recognized it for what it was: desire, dark and consuming. "And you, Elena Moreau, have been mine since the moment I scented you." She should argue, should point out that she wasn't anyone's property, that she had a say in her own fate. But the golden thread connecting them pulsed with shared need, and she found herself swaying toward him instead. "I can feel it," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "This connection between us, it's not just supernatural politics, is it? It's something else. It's everything else." His control was slipping. She could see it in the way his hands clenched at his sides, in the muscle ticking in his jaw. "It's the reason I haven't been able to concentrate on anything for months. The reason I find excuses to walk past your desk 17 times a day. The reason I know the exact moment you arrive each morning, because my wolf finally stops pacing." The confession hung between them, raw and honest in a way that made her chest tight. She'd noticed his attention, of course, had caught him watching her with an intensity that made her feel exposed and cherished at the same time. She'd told herself it was wishful thinking, that powerful men like Dominic Blackthorne didn't notice intern girls like her. She'd been wrong about that too. "The man you killed," she said, needing to understand all the pieces before she could process any of them. "He was here because of me." It wasn't a question, but Dominic nodded anyway. "An assassin sent by a rival faction. They discovered what you were becoming and decided to eliminate the threat before you could fully manifest your abilities." "But my abilities are manifesting anyway." She could still see the golden threads, still feel the supernatural energy flowing through the building like a living thing. "So killing me won't solve their problem anymore, will it?" "No," his voice was grim. "Now that your soul sight has awakened, other seers will be able to sense you. The council will know what you are within hours, maybe less." The impossibility of her situation crashed over her like a wave. 72 hours to choose between death, transformation, or binding herself to a man who was essentially a stranger who could turn into a wolf and tear out throats with his bare hands. A stranger who made her feel more alive than she'd ever been in her 23 years of existence. "What happens if I choose the bond?" she asked, proud of how steady her voice remained despite the chaos in her head. Something flickered in Dominic's eyes, hope quickly suppressed. "It would make you part of my pack. Give you the protection of my name and my strength. But Elena," he stepped back, and the loss of his nearness felt like a physical ache. "It would also bind you to me for life. Soul bonds can't be broken, can't be undone. You'd be tied to a monster who's killed more people than you can imagine." "You're not a monster." The words spilled out before she could stop them, driven by an instinct deeper than reason. "I should be terrified of you. Everything logical about this situation says I should be running and screaming and calling the police. But I'm not afraid. I should be, but I'm not." "You should be." His voice was rough with self-loathing. "I've done things, Elena. Terrible things in the name of pack law and territory disputes. I've ripped out throats and felt the life drain out of my enemies, and I've enjoyed it. There's a darkness in me that you can't imagine." She took a step toward him, ignoring the way he tensed like a cornered animal. "Then show me." "What?" "Show me the darkness. Let me see what you're really afraid I'll find." She was close enough now to touch him, close enough to see the flecks of gold swimming in his gray eyes. "You say I'm a soul seer, that I can see the truth of people. So let me see yours." For a moment, she thought he would refuse. Then his control shattered completely, and she was drowning in visions that belonged to him. She saw the wolf he became under the full moon, massive and terrible and beautiful. Saw him leading hunts through urban shadows, protecting his territory from threats both supernatural and human. Saw him making decisions that meant life or death for his pack, carrying the weight of their survival on his shoulders. But she also saw his loneliness, the burden of command that kept him isolated even among his own people. The curse he believed he carried, that everyone he'd ever loved had died violently, often by his own claws when he lost control during his early years as Alpha. And through it all, she saw his desperate need for connection, for someone who could see the man beneath the monster and choose to stay. "I see you," she whispered, reaching up to cup his face in her trembling hands. I see all of you, Dominic, the darkness and the light and everything in between. And I'm still here. His eyes fluttered closed at her touch, and she felt the exact moment his walls crumbled. Through their bond, she experienced his wonder, his disbelief that she could know the worst of him and still look at him with something approaching tenderness. You don't understand what you're choosing, he said, but his hands came up to cover hers, holding her touch against his skin like it was precious. Then explain it to me. She was standing so close now that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could see the way his pulse jumped in his throat. We have 72 hours. Help me understand what it means to be yours. The word yours seemed to hit him like a physical blow. His eyes snapped open, blazing gold, and suddenly she was pressed against the wall beside his office door, his body caging her in with careful precision. He wasn't touching her, not quite, but she could feel him everywhere, surrounding her with his presence and his scent and the barely leashed power that made her breath catch. If you're mine, he said, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper that made her knees weak. It means I'll never let you go. It means I'll kill anyone who tries to take you from me, and I won't lose a moment's sleep over it. His face was inches from hers now, close enough that she could see the flecks of amber in his eyes. It means you'll belong to me in ways that go deeper than law or custom or choice. Soul deep, Elena. Forever deep. She should be terrified. Should push him away and demand he call the police or the FBI or whoever handled situations involving supernatural death threats and impossible mate bonds. Instead, she found herself leaning into his heat, chasing the connection that sang between them like a live wire. And what would you be to me? Everything. The word was a growl, rough with promise and possession. Your protector, your provider, your partner in all things. The one who knows every secret you'll ever have, who'll stand between you and anything that threatens you. His hands flattened against the wall on either side of her head, his control hanging by the thinnest of threads. The one who'll worship your body and guard your heart and give you everything I am until the day I die. The intensity of his promise stole her breath. She could feel the truth of it through their bond, could see in his eyes that he meant every word with a fervor that bordered on religious devotion. 72 hours, she repeated, trying to process the magnitude of what he was offering, to decide if I want to spend forever bound to a man I barely know. You know me. His voice was soft now, almost vulnerable. Maybe not the details of my life, but you know me, Elena. You've known me since the first day you walked into this building and I caught your scent. Your soul recognized mine, just like mine recognized yours. She wanted to argue, wanted to point out that supernatural recognition wasn't the same as truly knowing someone. But the golden thread between them pulsed with shared memory, and suddenly she was experiencing months of stolen glances and carefully orchestrated encounters from his perspective. She saw herself through his eyes, arriving at work each morning with her hair still damp from her shower, the way she bit her pen when she was concentrating, the soft smile she gave to everyone she passed in the hallways. She felt his struggle to maintain professional distance when every instinct screamed at him to claim her, to mark her, to make sure every male in the building knew she was under his protection. She experienced his sleepless nights, pacing his penthouse and fighting the urge to drive to her apartment just to make sure she was safe. his careful orchestration of her work assignments to keep her close without raising suspicions, the way he'd memorized her schedule, her preferences, the tiny details that made her unique. "You've been courting me," she realized, the knowledge settling into place with stunning clarity. "All these months you've been trying to make me fall for you without revealing what you really were." Yes, no shame, no apology, just simple truth. And you were falling, weren't you, Elena? You felt it too, even if you didn't understand what it meant. She had been falling. God help her, she'd been halfway in love with Dominic Blackthorne before she'd ever seen him tear out a man's throat. All those fantasies, all those dreams that left her aching and restless, they'd been her soul calling to his, recognizing something her conscious mind couldn't accept. The dreams, she whispered, remembering nights when she'd woken up, reaching for someone who wasn't there, her body humming with need she couldn't name. "You dreamed of me." It wasn't a question. His eyes had gone molten again, and she could feel his satisfaction through their bond. "I felt them, Elena. Every night for the past 3 months, I felt you calling to me in your sleep." Heat flooded her cheeks at the admission. Some of those dreams had been decidedly not safe for work, featuring her mysterious, faceless lover doing things to her body that made her blush just thinking about them. "That's not possible," she protested weakly. "Mate bonds don't follow human rules." His smile was wicked, full of masculine satisfaction at her obvious embarrassment. "Distance means nothing when souls are calling to each other. Your dreams were an invitation, sweetheart. One I wanted to answer more than I wanted my next breath." The endearment sent shivers through her, intimate and possessive in a way that made her pulse race. No one had ever called her sweetheart and made it sound like a prayer and a promise all at once. "This is insane," she said again, but the protest lacked conviction. How could she call it insane when it felt more real than anything she'd ever experienced? "Completely insane," he agreed, and his voice held a note of dark humor. "Ancient, powerful, and absolutely unavoidable." "Welcome to the supernatural world, Elena." Population completely fucking crazy. Despite everything, the blood still staining his hands, the impossible revelations, the 72-hour deadline hanging over their heads, she found herself laughing. It was a short, slightly hysterical sound, but it was genuine. "I can't believe I'm even considering this," she said, shaking her head at her own lunacy. "You are considering it?" His voice dropped to that dangerous whisper again, and she could see hope flickering in his eyes. "Why?" She thought about lying, about claiming it was just shock or supernatural coercion or simple self-preservation, but the golden thread between them demanded honesty, and she found herself telling him the truth. "Because for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Chapter 2. The words hung between them like a confession, raw and honest in the charged air of his blood-stained office. Elena watched something fundamental shift in Dominic's expression, hope warring with disbelief, desire clashing against terror. The golden thread connecting them pulsed brighter, and through it she felt the exact moment his carefully maintained control began to fracture. "Elena." Her name on his lips was a prayer and a warning all at once. "You don't know what you're saying." "Yes, I do." The certainty in her own voice surprised her. 20 minutes ago, She'd been a simple intern delivering quarterly reports. Now she was staring into the eyes of a predator who'd just killed for her protection, and instead of running, she was stepping closer. I've spent my entire life feeling like I was waiting for something I couldn't name, like there was this missing piece of myself that I'd never find. His hands were trembling where they pressed against the wall beside her head. She could see the effort it took him to maintain even that small distance between them, could feel his desperate need to touch her warring with his terror of what might happen if he did. And now, his voice was rough, barely human. Now I know what I was waiting for. She lifted her hand, hovering it inches from his cheek, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his skin. I was waiting for you. The confession shattered something inside him. She felt it through their bond. A dam breaking, releasing months of suppressed longing and carefully controlled hunger. His eyes blazed gold, and when he spoke, his voice carried the full weight of his supernatural nature. You have no idea what you do to me, he said, and every word was edged with barely leashed power. What you've been doing to me since the moment you walked into my building, tell me. The request slipped out before she could stop it, driven by a need to understand the intensity crackling between them. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Only dark promise and dangerous hunger. You want to know what you do to me, Elena? You want to understand what these past 6 months have been like? She nodded, not trusting her voice. Every morning at exactly 7:43, you walk through those lobby doors wearing something that smells like vanilla and rain. My wolf knows you're in the building before you even reach the elevators. Do you know how many times I've had to lock myself in this office and fight the urge to hunt you down, to corner you in some empty hallway and mark you as mine? The raw confession sent heat spiraling through her belly. She could picture it being trapped between his body and a wall, his mouth hot against her throat, claiming her in the most primitive way possible. Every time you bite that pen when you're concentrating, he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that made her shiver, I imagine those teeth on my skin. Every time you laugh at something on your computer screen, I want to be the one putting that joy on your face. And every time some male colleague gets too close to your desk, I have to remind myself that murder is generally frowned upon in corporate environments. She was drowning in the intensity of his gaze, in the raw need pouring through their connection. You've been watching me that closely.
Watching you? Elena, I've been obsessed with you. His admission was fierce, unapologetic. I know that you take your coffee with 2 sugars and a splash of cream. I know you get a little line between your eyebrows when you're working on something challenging. I know you unconsciously touch that pendant at your throat whenever you're nervous or thinking hard about something.
As if summoned by his words, her hand rose to trace the Celtic knot hanging at her throat. The silver was warm against her fingertips, almost burning where it touched her skin. I know you stay late on Thursdays, because that's when you think no one will notice you organizing files that aren't your responsibility, he continued, and his voice held a note of fond exasperation. I know you bring homemade cookies for the security guards and remember everyone's birthdays, even though you've only been here 6 months. Each observation hit her like a physical touch, intimate in its accuracy. She hadn't realized how closely he'd been paying attention, hadn't known that her small kindnesses and unconscious habits had been catalogued with such precision. I know you have nightmares sometimes because you come in the next day with shadows under your eyes and you drink twice as much coffee, he said. And now his voice was gentler, tinged with concern. I know something happened to you when you were younger, something that still hurts, because I can smell the grief on you sometimes when you think no one's looking. Tears pricked at her eyes. He was right, of course. The dreams that plagued her sleep weren't just supernatural visions. They were memories of that terrible night when her parents died, mixed with fragments of things she'd never understood. Images of golden eyes in the darkness and voices speaking in languages that sounded like growls and whispers. How long have you been able to see the threads? She asked, needing to shift the focus away from her own pain before it overwhelmed her. I can't see them. His answer surprised her. That's your gift, not mine, but I can feel them. The pull between us has been driving me insane for months. Then how did you know what I was seeing when you asked about the golden thread? His smile was sharp, predatory. Because I've been alive for over 200 years, Elena. I've seen soul seers before, though none as powerful as you're going to be. And I've never felt a mate bond this strong. 200 years. The number hit her like a slap, driving home just how far out of her depths she was. While she'd been struggling through college and internships, he'd been walking the earth for longer than her great-grandparents had been alive. You're immortal? She asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Not immortal. We can be killed. But we age very slowly once we reach maturity. I stopped aging at 35 about 170 years ago. The age difference should have been horrifying, should have made her feel like a child playing with forces beyond her comprehension. Instead, it explained the bone-deep weariness she sometimes glimpsed in his eyes. The way he carried himself like someone who'd seen too much and carried too many burdens. Is that part of what you meant when you said you were cursed? She asked. Living that long, losing everyone you care about? Something flickered across his face. Old pain, carefully hidden but still raw after all these years. That's part of it, he admitted, but not the worst part. What's the worst part? He was quiet for so long, she didn't think he was going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. The worst part is that everyone I've ever loved has died violently, usually by my own claws. His eyes met hers, and she saw the full weight of his self-loathing reflected there. I lose control when people I care about are threatened. The wolf takes over completely, and I become something that can't distinguish between enemy and ally, between threat and innocent bystander. The confession hung between them like a blade. She could feel the truth of it through their bond, could sense the memories he was trying to suppress, images of blood and violence and the horrific aftermath of his protective instincts gone wrong. How many? She asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. 3. Each word was torn from somewhere deep inside him. My first mate, Sarah, in 1847. My closest friend and pack brother, Marcus, in 1923. And my adopted daughter, Rebecca, in 19... The names fell between them like stones, each one carrying the weight of unbearable loss. Through their connection, she caught fragments of his memories, a woman with dark hair and gentle hands torn apart by his claws during a territorial dispute, a man who'd stood by his side for decades dying because Dominic couldn't control his protective fury, a young girl who'd called him father, bleeding out in his arms because he'd shifted without warning when rival wolves threatened their home. That's why you've been fighting this, she realized. The attraction between us. You're not afraid I'll reject you. You're afraid you'll kill me. I won't let it happen again. The words were a vow, fierce and desperate. I'd rather watch you walk away and spend the rest of my existence alone than see you die because I couldn't control myself. The pain in his voice was unbearable. She could feel it echoing through their bond, a wound that had never properly healed despite the passage of decades. He truly believed he was a monster, cursed to destroy everything he touched. But Elena could see deeper than his guilt and self-hatred. Through her awakening soul sight, she could perceive the golden threads that connected him to his pack, to the city he protected, to the supernatural community that looked to him for leadership. She could see the love and loyalty he inspired, the lives he'd saved, the balance he maintained between the human and supernatural worlds. Most importantly, she could see the thread that bound them together, not fragile or dangerous, but strong and pure, and absolutely unbreakable. You're wrong, she said, and her voice carried a certainty that surprised them both. Elena, no, listen to me. She finally gave in to the urge to touch him, pressing her palm against his cheek. He went absolutely still at the contact, his breathing harsh and uneven. I can see it, Dominic. The real truth, not the story you've been telling yourself for over a century. What do you see? The question was barely a whisper. I see that you didn't lose control because you're a monster. You lost control because you loved them, and love made you desperate. Her thumb traced the sharp line of his cheekbone, marveling at how he leaned into her touch despite his obvious fear. But our bond is different. I can feel it. I can see it. How is it different? Because I'm not fragile. The knowledge flowed through her as she spoke, understanding dawning with each word. I'm not human, not completely. Whatever bloodline gave me this gift also gave me the strength to match an alpha's power. I won't break if you lose control, Dominic. I'll anchor you. Hope flickered in his eyes, quickly suppressed. You don't know that. You can't be sure. Yes, I can. She pulled his face down until their foreheads touched, sharing breath and space and the electric energy crackling between them. Feel it through our bond. Really feel it, not through your fear and guilt, but through the connection itself. She felt him opening himself to the link between them, letting his barriers drop for the first time since she'd walked into his office. The sensation was overwhelming, his emotions flooding through her with an intensity that stole her breath. But underneath the fear and desperate longing, she felt something else. Recognition, his wolf recognizing her not as prey to be protected, but as an equal. A mate capable of standing beside him rather than behind him. You feel it too, she breathed, watching understanding dawn in his expression. Impossible, he whispered, but his hands came up to frame her face, trembling with the magnitude of what he was sensing. Soul seers aren't. They're not supposed to be. Aren't supposed to be what? Strong enough to handle a primordial alpha. His voice was filled with wonder and terror in equal measure. The bloodlines died out centuries ago. They were hunted to extinction because they were too powerful, too dangerous to the established order. Maybe they weren't hunted to extinction, Elena suggested. pieces of her grandmother's stories suddenly clicking into place. Maybe they went into hiding. Maybe they've been waiting for the right moment to emerge again. The implications hit him like a physical blow. She could see his mind racing, calculating what it would mean if she was right. A soul seer strong enough to bond with a primordial alpha would be a force that could reshape the supernatural world. They would be unstoppable together, and absolutely terrifying to anyone who benefited from the current power structure. The council, he breathed. If they realize what you are, what we could become together, they'll try to destroy us both, she finished. That's why the assassin was here tonight, wasn't it? Someone already knows. His expression went deadly, and she felt his protective instincts surge through their bond with enough force to make her gasp. They'll have to go through me first. And Elena, I promise you, anyone who tries to hurt you will discover exactly why my enemies fear the darkness. The threat should have been terrifying. Instead, it sent heat spiraling through her belly and made her pulse race with something that definitely wasn't fear. There was something primitively satisfying about having a predator of Dominic's caliber willing to kill for her protection. You like that, he said, and his voice was rough with surprise and dark satisfaction. You like knowing I'd destroy anyone who threatened you. She should deny it, should be horrified by her own reaction. Instead, she found herself pressing closer to him, drawn by the heat and power radiating from his skin. I like knowing you're mine as much as I'm yours, she admitted, the words spilling out before she could stop them. Something primal flickered across his face. Possession and hunger and desperate need all rolled into one devastating expression. Say it again. Which part? The part where you're mine. His voice dropped to that dangerous whisper that made her knees weak. I need to hear you say it, Elena. I need to know you understand what you're choosing. The intensity in his gaze should have been overwhelming. Instead, it made her feel powerful in a way she'd never experienced before. Here was a man who commanded respect from supernatural beings across the globe, who could tear apart enemies with his bare hands, who'd lived for 2 centuries and seen empires rise and fall, and he was looking at her like she held his entire world in her hands. I'm yours, she said, and watched his eyes flare gold at the words. But more than that, Dominic, you're mine, and I'm not letting anyone take you from me either. The confession broke the last of his restraint. One moment she was standing against the wall with careful space between them, and the next she was crushed against his chest, his mouth claiming hers with desperate hunger. The kiss was nothing like the gentle, romantic first kisses she'd imagined during her teenage fantasies. This was pure possession, raw need given physical form. His lips were hot and demanding against hers, and when she opened for him with a soft gasp, he took immediate advantage, his tongue stroking into her mouth with bold confidence. She could taste the danger on him, the barely leashed violence that lurked beneath his civilized exterior. But she could also taste something else. Desperate relief, as if he'd been holding his breath for months and could finally exhale. The golden thread between them blazed brighter with each passing second, and she felt their connection deepening beyond anything she'd thought possible. Through their bond, she experienced the kiss from his perspective, the silk of her hair between his fingers, the soft sound she made when he nipped at her lower lip, the way she fit against him like she'd been made for this moment. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she felt fundamentally changed. Not just by the supernatural revelations or the mate bond, but by the simple recognition that this was what she'd been searching for her entire life without knowing it. Elena, her name was a growl against her lips, rough with need and wonder. We need to talk about what happens next. She didn't want to talk. She wanted to lose herself in the heat building between them, to explore the connection that sang in her blood and made her feel more alive than she'd ever been. But she could see the struggle in his eyes, desire warring with responsibility, need clashing against the ingrained protective instincts that had kept him alive for 2 centuries. What happens next? She asked, though part of her already knew the answer would be complicated. Next, we figure out how to keep you alive for longer than 72 hours. His hands were still framing her face, thumbs stroking across her cheekbones with devastating gentleness. The council won't be the only threat. When word spreads about what you are, every supernatural faction with an agenda will want to either control you or eliminate you. The reminder of their precarious situation sent a chill through her, tempering the heat that had been building between them. How do we fight something like that? We don't fight them all, he said, and his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions. We make them fight each other instead. How? His smile was sharp as a blade, filled with the kind of predatory intelligence that had made him a successful alpha for over a century. By giving them something they want more than they want to control you, which is power. He stepped back, putting crucial distance between them, and she immediately missed his warmth. Your ability to see mate bonds makes you incredibly valuable, Elena. You can expose false alliances, identify true partnerships, reveal the hidden connections that drive supernatural politics. Understanding dawned with stunning clarity. You want me to become a player in their world instead of just a victim. I want you to become the most important player in their world, he corrected. Someone too valuable to kill, too dangerous to ignore, and too powerful to control. The scope of what he was suggesting stole her breath. He was talking about fundamentally altering her entire existence, transforming her from a simple intern into someone who could reshape supernatural society. That's assuming I survive long enough to establish that kind of position, she pointed out. You will. The certainty in his voice was absolute, because I'll make sure of it, because my pack will make sure of it, and because you're stronger than you realize, Elena, strong enough to claim your place in a world that's tried to erase your bloodline from existence. She wanted to believe him, wanted to embrace the confidence he had in her potential. But the magnitude of what lay ahead was overwhelming. I don't know how to be what you're describing, she admitted. I don't know how to navigate supernatural politics or use my abilities as weapons. 24 hours ago, I didn't even know this world existed. Then we'll teach you. His voice was gentle now, understanding her fear even as he refused to let her surrender to it. My pack includes some of the most knowledgeable supernatural beings on the continent. We have connections, resources, centuries of accumulated wisdom, everything you need to not just survive, but thrive. And if I can't do it, if I'm not strong enough or smart enough or whatever enough to become this force you're describing, then we'll find another way. His hands settled on her shoulders, warm and reassuring. But Elena, I've been watching you for 6 months. I've seen how you handle pressure, how you adapt to new challenges, how you find solutions to problems that stump people with decades more experience. You have the intelligence and the instincts to do this. You just need to trust yourself, trust herself. The advice was simple in theory, monumentally difficult in practice. She'd spent most of her life dismissing her instincts, ignoring the strange feelings and intuitive leaps that had made her feel different from everyone around her. Now he was asking her to embrace those very qualities as strengths. "There's something else," she said, remembering the visions that had been flooding her awareness since her soul sight awakened. "I'm not just seeing the bonds between people. I'm seeing threats, things moving through the shadows, supernatural beings with hostile intentions converging on this location." His expression went deadly serious. "How many?" "At least a dozen." She closed her eyes, trying to focus on the impressions flowing through her expanded awareness. "They're not all the same species. Some feel like you, but different. Colder, and there are others that don't feel like anything I understand. Council enforcers and hired mercenaries," Dominic concluded grimly. "They're moving faster than I expected." "How long do we have?" He was already moving toward his desk, pressing hidden panels that revealed weapons Elena hadn't known existed in the corporate environment. Guns, knives, and other implements she couldn't identify, but that radiated an aura of supernatural menace. "Maybe an hour," he said, checking the chamber of a pistol that looked like it belonged in a military arsenal rather than a CEO's office. "Maybe less." The casual way he handled the weapons drove home the reality of their situation. This wasn't some romantic fantasy where love conquered all and everything worked out perfectly. This was a matter of life and death, with Elena caught between forces that had been playing deadly games for centuries. "What do I do?" she asked, surprised by how calm she sounded despite the terror clawing at her chest. "You stay close to me," he said, and his voice carried the full weight of an alpha's command. "You trust your instincts, you use whatever abilities you can access, and you remember that you're not alone in this." "But I don't know how to fight supernatural beings. I don't know how to use these abilities I'm supposedly developing. I'm just—" "You're my mate." The words cut through her rising panic with absolute authority. "Do you know what that means in our world, Elena?" She shook her head, not trusting her voice. "It means you're under the protection of a Primordial Alpha and his entire pack. It means anyone who threatens you is declaring war on one of the oldest and most powerful supernatural bloodlines in existence." His eyes blazed gold as he spoke, and she could feel the truth of his words resonating through their bond. "It means you're not some helpless human stumbling into a situation beyond your comprehension. You're a Soul Seer, whose mate happens to be one of the most dangerous predators on the continent." The fierce pride in his voice sent warmth spreading through her chest. She might be new to this world, might not understand all its rules and dangers, but she wasn't as powerless as she'd been thinking. Besides, he continued, securing weapons at various points on his body with practiced efficiency, you've already proven you're not as helpless as you think. How? You survived 23 years with a dormant soul sight in a world where your bloodline is actively hunted. That takes either incredible luck or unconscious skill. His smile was sharp, predatory, and luck doesn't explain how you've been avoiding supernatural attention for over a decade. She thought about that, remembering all the times she'd changed directions on seemingly random impulses, chosen different routes home for no reason she could articulate, or simply felt uncomfortable in certain situations and left early. Instinct she'd attributed to anxiety or paranoia might have actually been her supernatural senses keeping her safe. My grandmother, she said suddenly, pieces clicking into place. She didn't just tell me stories about supernatural creatures. She was training me, teaching me to trust my instincts, to recognize danger, to protect myself without ever explaining why. Smart woman. Dominic finished his weapons check and moved back to her, his presence immediately calming her racing heart. What else did she teach you? She used to make me practice meditation exercises that I thought were just for relaxation. But now that I think about it, they were designed to help me control whatever abilities I was developing. Elena frowned, trying to remember details she'd dismissed as childhood games. She taught me to visualize golden light, to imagine threads connecting all living things, to sense the emotions of people around me. She was preparing you for exactly this moment, Dominic realized. She knew your abilities would manifest eventually, and she wanted you to have some foundation to build on when they did. Then why didn't she tell me the truth? Because knowledge without power is dangerous in our world. If you'd known what you were before your abilities awakened, you would have been vulnerable to anyone who could sense your potential. His expression softened with something that might have been grief. She was protecting you the only way she could. The reminder of her grandmother's death sent a fresh wave of loss through her. Grandmère had passed away when Elena was 18, taking her stories and secrets to the grave. Now Elena was left to navigate this new reality without the guidance of the one person who'd understood what she truly was. I miss her, she admitted, fingering the Celtic knot pendant that was all she had left of the woman who'd shaped so much of her childhood. She's still with you, Dominic said gently. Everything she taught you, every instinct she helped you develop, that's her legacy. And right now, we're going to need every bit of wisdom she passed down. As if summoned by his words, Elena felt a familiar presence at the edge of her consciousness, warm, loving, and utterly unmistakable. Her grandmother's voice seemed to whisper through her awareness, speaking in the mixture of English and French she'd used when Elena was small. Trust your heart, ma petite. Trust your mate. Trust the gifts that flow in your blood. She's here, Elena breathed, wonder and grief tangling in her chest. I can feel her. Dominic's expression grew thoughtful. Soul seers sometimes maintain connections to deceased loved ones, especially family members who shared similar abilities. Your grandmother may be trying to guide you from beyond. The idea should have been terrifying. Communicating with the dead wasn't exactly covered in her business school curriculum. Instead, it felt natural, like accessing a part of herself that had always been there but dormant. Through her connection to her grandmother's spirit, she felt a sudden surge of information, fragments of knowledge about supernatural politics, techniques for controlling her emerging abilities, and most importantly, a deep sense of approval for the choice she was making. He is worthy of you, ma chérie. His heart is true, even if his past is dark. Trust the bond between you. She approves, Elena told Dominic, smiling despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. She says you're worthy of me. Something vulnerable flickered across his face at that. I'm honored by her blessing, he said formally, and she could feel through their bond how much her grandmother's approval meant to him. The moment of connection was shattered by a new sensation, cold, predatory hunger pressing against the edges of her awareness. The supernatural beings she'd sensed earlier were getting closer, and their intentions were unmistakably hostile. They're almost here, she warned, her body tensing with primitive alarm. Dominic's expression went deadly, and she felt his wolf stirring beneath his skin, responding to the threat with violent anticipation. How many can you sense now? She closed her eyes, extending her awareness as far as she could manage. The golden threads that connected all living things blazed brighter in her mind, but overlaying them were darker strands, bonds forged through fear, coercion, and supernatural compulsion, rather than genuine connection. 15, she said, opening her eyes to meet his gaze. Maybe 16, and Dominic, some of them aren't entirely willing participants. I can see threads of compulsion binding them to whoever's leading this attack. His jaw clenched. Mind control. The Council's favorite way of maintaining deniability. Can we help them? Not if they're trying to kill us, he said grimly. Compelled or not, they're still dangerous. Our priority has to be survival first, liberation second. The harsh pragmatism in his voice reminded her again that this wasn't a fairy tale where everyone could be saved and everything worked out perfectly. This was a world where sometimes good people were forced to do terrible things, and survival required making choices that would haunt you forever. Is there another way out of here? She asked, glancing toward the office windows that looked out over the city 40 stories below. Several, he confirmed. But Elena, I need you to understand something before we run. Once we leave this building, there's no going back to your old life. Ever. The supernatural world will know what you are, and that knowledge will follow you everywhere for the rest of your existence. The finality in his voice hit her like a physical blow. She thought about her small apartment with its collection of unread books and half-finished craft projects. Her few close friends from college who still met for coffee and complained about their entry-level jobs. The normal, mundane life she'd been building one careful step at a time. All of it was about to disappear forever. I know, she said, and was surprised to realize she meant it. I think part of me has always known I didn't really belong in that world anyway. No regrets? She thought about it seriously, trying to imagine what her life would have been like if she'd never discovered the truth about herself, or about him. Safe, perhaps. Comfortable, but also fundamentally incomplete, like she was always waiting for something she couldn't name. No regrets, she confirmed. But Dominic, what if I can't do this? What if I'm not strong enough or brave enough to be what you need me to be? Then we'll figure it out together. His hands cupped her face again, thumbs stroking across her cheekbones with infinite gentleness. But Elena, you need to stop underestimating yourself. You've already proven you're brave enough to face impossible revelations and strong enough to choose love over safety. Everything else we can work on. Love. He'd said it so casually, as if it was a foregone conclusion rather than something that typically developed over time. But as the word settled into her consciousness, she realized he was right. What she felt for him went beyond attraction or even the supernatural pull of their mate bond. It was love in its purest, most elemental form, the recognition of another soul that completed her own. "I love you too," she said, watching his eyes flare with surprise and desperate hope. "I know that should be impossible after knowing you for less than an hour." "Nothing's impossible for us," he interrupted, and his voice was rough with emotion. "Not anymore." The kiss that followed was different from their first, softer, deeper, filled with promise rather than desperate hunger. Through their bond, she felt his wonder at her acceptance, his gratitude that she was choosing him despite every logical reason to run. When they broke apart, she felt centered in a way she'd never experienced before. Whatever came next, whatever dangers they faced, she wouldn't face them alone. "Ready?" he asked, offering her his hand. She looked at his outstretched palm, strong, elegant, stained with blood from defending her, trembling slightly with the magnitude of what he was offering. Not just protection or partnership, but a complete transformation of everything she thought she knew about herself and her place in the world. "Ready?" she said, and placed her hand in his. The moment their skin touched, the golden thread between them blazed so brightly it was visible even without her soul sight activated. Whatever happened next, whatever enemies they faced, or obstacles they had to overcome, they would face them as mates, as equals, as two halves of something that had the potential to reshape the supernatural world. The thought should have been terrifying. Instead, as Dominic led her toward a hidden panel in his office wall that revealed a private elevator, Elena felt more alive than she'd ever been in her 23 years of existence. Behind them, the sound of shattering glass announced that their enemies had arrived. Ahead of them lay a future filled with danger, possibility, and a love strong enough to challenge the foundations of supernatural society itself. Elena squeezed Dominic's hand tighter and stepped into the elevator that would carry them away from her old life and toward whatever destiny awaited. The last thing she saw before the doors closed was the golden thread of their bond stretching between them, unbreakable and eternal, blazing with enough power to light up the darkness. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The elevator descended in absolute silence. The only sound their synchronized breathing and the faint hum of machinery carrying them away from immediate danger. Elena pressed herself against the mirrored wall, watching their reflection. A blood-stained CEO and a terrified intern who looked nothing like the confident supernatural power broker Dominic seemed to believe she could become. "Where are we going?" she asked, needing something to focus on besides the growing intensity of their mate bond. "Safe house," Dominic replied, his attention focused on a control panel that definitely hadn't been installed by the building's original contractors. "My pack maintains several locations throughout the city for exactly this kind of situation." Pack. The word sent a thrill of anticipation and terror through her. Soon she would meet others like him, supernatural beings who had pledged their loyalty to the man beside her. People who might view her as either a welcome addition or a dangerous liability. Will they accept me? The question slipped out before she could stop it, revealing insecurities she hadn't realized she was harboring. Dominic's reflection met her eyes in the mirrored wall, and his expression softened with understanding. "They'll love you," he said with absolute certainty, "not just because you're my mate, though that alone would earn their protection. They'll love you because of who you are, Elena, because of the strength and kindness I've been watching for months." "How can you be so sure?" "Because I know my pack." The elevator slowed, approaching whatever destination he'd programmed. They're not just wolves bound together by supernatural law. They're family, chosen and earned through decades of shared struggle. And family protects its... The elevator stopped with a soft chime, and the doors opened to reveal an underground parking garage that looked ordinary except for the fact that every vehicle was clearly armored and modified for purposes that had nothing to do with commuting to work. "This way," Dominic said, leading her toward a sleek black SUV that looked like it could survive a small war. As they walked, Elena became aware of presences moving in the shadows, supernatural beings with predatory grace and alert intelligence. She could see them now through her awakening soul sight, golden threads connecting them to Dominic in patterns that spoke of loyalty, respect, and genuine affection. "Your pack," she realized. "Some of them." He opened the passenger door for her with old-fashioned courtesy that seemed incongruous given their circumstances. "My beta, Marcus, and a few of our best fighters. They've been monitoring the building since the first assassin arrived." Elena slid into the passenger seat, immediately surrounded by scents that were unmistakably masculine and predatory, but somehow comforting rather than threatening. The interior of the vehicle was luxurious but functional, designed for both comfort and combat. Dominic settled beside her, and the moment he closed his door, she felt their isolation break as pack members emerged from the shadows. Through the tinted windows, she caught glimpses of faces that ranged from curious to protective to openly speculative. "Elena," Dominic said, his voice carrying formal weight, "I'd like you to meet my beta and closest friend, Marcus Steele." The man who approached the driver's side window was tall and lean, with the kind of weathered handsomeness that spoke of someone who'd seen considerable violence and survived it all. His dark hair was streaked with premature silver, and his green eyes held an intelligence that immediately reminded her why Dominic had chosen him as second in command. When Marcus slid into the driver's seat, Elena caught his scent, pine and leather, and something wild that marked him as definitely not human. But unlike the predatory edge that always surrounded Dominic, Marcus radiated a calmer energy, though no less dangerous. "So," Marcus said, starting the engine with practiced efficiency, "you're the one who's been driving our Alpha to distraction for months." "Marcus," Dominic warned, but there was fondness in his voice, rather than genuine irritation. "What?" Marcus grinned, glancing at Elena in the rearview mirror. "I'm just saying, it's nice to finally meet the woman who made our fearless leader start checking his appearance every morning and actually caring about his schedule." Heat flooded Elena's cheeks. He was checking his appearance? "Every morning," Marcus confirmed cheerfully. "Started wearing different ties, making sure his hair was perfect, even switched to a cologne that wasn't his usual brand. Took us weeks to figure out he was unconsciously trying to appeal to his mate's preferences. I was not, Dominic began. You absolutely were. Another voice interrupted from the back seat, and Elena turned to see a woman with short auburn hair and amber eyes that marked her as another werewolf. I'm Sarah, by the way, pack enforcer and Marcus's mate. The easy familiarity between them was immediately apparent, not just in the casual way Sarah draped herself across the back of Marcus's seat, but in the golden threads Elena could see connecting them. Their mate bond was older, more settled than the blazing intensity of her connection to Dominic, but no less powerful. It's nice to meet you, Elena said, meaning it. These people were offering her acceptance and protection without knowing anything about her, except that she was important to their alpha. Trust me, the pleasure is ours, Sarah replied. Do you have any idea how insufferable he's been lately? Prowling around the office, snapping at everyone, working 18-hour days, because he couldn't concentrate on anything except when you'd be coming in. Sarah, Dominic growled. I'm just giving her context, Sarah said innocently. She should know that the big bad alpha has been completely wrapped around her little finger since day one. Despite the gravity of their situation, Elena found herself smiling. There was something deeply reassuring about the pack's obvious affection for Dominic and their willingness to tease him despite his dangerous reputation. Where are we headed? She asked as Marcus navigated through underground tunnels she hadn't known existed beneath the city. Pack house, Dominic explained. It's the most defensible location we have, and Elena needs to meet the others before we start planning our next move. How many others? 12 in the immediate pack family, Sarah answered. Though we have alliances with several other groups that could provide additional support if needed. 12. Elena tried to process the idea of suddenly having 12 new supernatural family members, each with their own personality, history, and expectations. The magnitude of how completely her life was changing hit her again, making her chest tight with anxiety. Hey, Dominic said softly, apparently sensing her emotional state through their bond. Remember what I told you about trusting yourself. These people are going to love you, Elena. Just be yourself. What if myself isn't enough? Then they're idiots, Sarah said bluntly from the back seat. And we don't keep idiots in our pack. Marcus chuckled. Subtle as always. Love. Subtlety is overrated, Sarah replied. Elena, look at me. Elena turned to meet the other woman's amber gaze, surprised by the fierce protectiveness she saw there. You walked into a situation that should have sent you screaming for the hills, Sarah said. You accepted truths that would have broken most people's minds. You chose to trust a man covered in blood who admitted to being a predator. Either you're completely insane or you have instincts most humans never develop. Either way, you belong with us. The simple acceptance in her voice was overwhelming. Elena had expected suspicion, maybe resentment from pack members who might see her as an outsider, threatening their established dynamic. Instead, she was being welcomed with the kind of fierce loyalty she'd only seen in movies. Thank you, she managed, her voice thick with emotion. Don't thank us yet, Marcus said, his tone turning serious. Thank us after we've kept you alive long enough to properly join the family. The reminder of their precarious situation sobered the mood in the vehicle. Through her soul sight, Elena could sense other supernatural presences in the tunnels around them, some friendly, others neutral, and a few that radiated the cold hostility she was learning to associate with enemies. "Are we being followed?" she asked. "Yes," Dominic confirmed, but not successfully. These tunnels were designed by supernatural architects with layers of misdirection and defensive measures. Anyone tracking us will find themselves very lost very quickly. And if they don't get lost, then they'll find themselves very dead very quickly, Sarah said with cheerful menace. Elena was beginning to understand that her new pack family approached violence with a casualness that should have been disturbing. Instead, she found their willingness to kill for her protection oddly comforting. After a lifetime of feeling like she had to face everything alone, having a group of supernatural predators willing to defend her was almost overwhelmingly reassuring. The tunnels began to slope upward, and soon they emerged into what looked like the underground garage of an exclusive residential building. But as they drove toward a private elevator, Elena could see defensive modifications that marked this as something far more secure than a typical urban residence. "The pack house is actually 3 connected buildings," Dominic explained as they parked. "Residential areas, training facilities, business offices, and enough defensive capability to withstand a small army." "Has it ever been attacked?" "Twice," Marcus answered. "Both times the attackers discovered why our pack has maintained independence for over a century." They rode the elevator to the main residential level, and Elena found herself growing more nervous with each passing floor. Meeting Dominic's pack was a crucial step in her integration into the supernatural world, and she desperately wanted to make a good impression. When the elevator doors opened, she was struck first by the warmth of the space. Despite the obvious wealth and security measures, the pack house felt like a home rather than a fortress. Rich woods, comfortable furniture, and personal touches created an atmosphere of safety and belonging. "Everyone's in the main gathering room," Sarah said, leading them down a hallway lined with pack photos and artwork. "Fair warning, they're all incredibly curious about you, so expect some intense scrutiny." Elena's steps faltered. "What kind of scrutiny?" "The kind that comes from a pack that loves their alpha and wants to make sure his mate is worthy of him," Dominic said gently. "But, Elena, they're also going to be assessing whether you're strong enough to handle what's coming. Not to judge you, but to understand how best to protect and support you." Before she could ask what he meant by that, they reached a set of double doors that Sarah pushed open to reveal a large, comfortable room filled with people who were unmistakably supernatural. The conversations stopped the moment they entered. Elena found herself the focus of 12 pairs of eyes that ranged from merely curious to intensely protective. Through her soul sight, she could see the complex web of relationships connecting each pack member to the others, bonds forged through shared danger, mutual respect, and genuine affection. "Everyone," Dominic said, his voice carrying the natural authority that marked him as alpha, "I'd like you to meet Elena Moreau, my mate." The silence that followed was pregnant with significance. Elena could feel them assessing her, not with hostility, but with the careful attention of people whose survival depended on accurately reading others. Then a woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes stepped forward, and Elena immediately sensed that this was someone important within the pack hierarchy. "Elena," the woman said warmly. "I'm Catherine, Dominic's pack mother, and the closest thing he's had to family since he was turned. Welcome home, dear one." The formal greeting carried weight that went beyond simple politeness. By calling her dear one and welcoming her home, Catherine was publicly acknowledging Elena's place in the pack before any formal ceremonies or bonding rituals. "Thank you," Elena managed, overwhelmed by the acceptance in the older woman's voice. "Now then," Catherine continued, turning to address the rest of the pack, "I believe introductions are in order. Elena, these are your new family members." What followed was a whirlwind of names, faces, and supernatural abilities that left Elena's head spinning. There was James, the pack's tech specialist, whose ability to interface with electronic systems bordered on supernatural itself. Twin brothers Alex and Adrian, who served as scouts and reconnaissance specialists. A woman named Luna, whose empathic abilities made her the pack's unofficial counselor and mediator. Each introduction came with a brief demonstration of abilities, James making the room's smart systems respond to his mental commands, the twins moving with inhuman speed and coordination. Luna reading Elena's emotional state with uncanny accuracy. "We're showing off," Dominic murmured in her ear, amusement clear in his voice. "They want to impress you." "They're succeeding," Elena admitted, watching a pack member named Devon manipulate shadows like living things. "Your turn," Catherine said gently. "We'd love to see what gifts you're developing if you're comfortable sharing." Elena felt a moment of panic. Her abilities were still largely uncontrolled, and she had no idea how to demonstrate them on command. But as she looked around the room at faces filled with encouragement rather than judgment, she decided to trust her instincts. Closing her eyes, she extended her soul sight as far as she could manage, letting herself really see the supernatural world for the first time without fear or resistance. The result was breathtaking. Golden threads blazed throughout the room, connecting each pack member to the others in patterns of loyalty, affection, and shared purpose. But Elena could see deeper than simple relationships. She could perceive the true nature of each bond, the strengths and vulnerabilities, the places where connections were strongest and where they might be tested. More than that, she could see the pack's connection to the larger supernatural community. Threads stretched out beyond the walls of the house, linking them to allies, enemies, and neutral parties throughout the city and beyond. "Extraordinary," Catherine breathed, and Elena opened her eyes to find the entire pack staring at her with expressions of awe and respect. "What did you see?" Dominic asked, though she suspected he already knew from the wonder in his voice. "Everything," Elena said simply. "I can see how you're all connected, not just to each other but to the entire supernatural ecosystem. I can see alliance patterns, potential threats, weak points in enemy organizations." She trailed off, realizing the implications of what she was describing. "She's not just a soul seer," Marcus said quietly. "She's a network seer. I thought that bloodline was extinct." "Network seer?" Elena asked. "It's what soul seers become when their abilities reach full maturity," Catherine explained, her voice filled with something approaching reverence. Instead of just seeing individual bonds, you can perceive entire relationship networks. It's the rarest supernatural gift in existence, and the most strategically valuable. Elena felt the weight of their stares and tried not to let it overwhelm her. Is that good or bad? It's dangerous, Dominic said honestly. Network seers have been hunted to extinction because their abilities can destabilize entire power structures. If you can see the true relationships between supernatural factions, you can exploit weaknesses, predict alliances, and identify the connections that hold enemy organizations together. Or, Sarah added with a predatory smile, you can tear those organizations apart by severing the right bonds at the right moments. The casual way she discussed destroying enemy factions should have been frightening. Instead, Elena found herself intrigued by the strategic possibilities her abilities represented. How do I learn to control it? She asked. We'll teach you, Catherine promised, but Elena, dear, you need to understand that developing these abilities will make you a target for every supernatural faction with political ambitions. There will be attempts to capture you, to control you, to use your gifts for purposes that have nothing to do with your own well-being. There will also be attempts to kill you, James added bluntly. Some factions will decide you're too dangerous to exist, regardless of your intentions. The harsh reality of her situation settled over Elena like a weight. She wasn't just joining a supernatural community, she was positioning herself at the center of political machinations that could span centuries. I won't let that happen, Dominic said, and his voice carried the full authority of his alpha nature. Elena is under my protection, which means she's under the protection of this entire pack. Anyone who threatens her threatens us all. And we don't react well to threats, Adrian said with casual menace. No, we don't, his twin Alex agreed. Elena looked around the room at faces that had transformed from curious to fiercely protective. These people barely knew her, but they were already willing to fight and die for her, simply because she was their alpha's mate. Why? She asked, needing to understand the depth of loyalty she was witnessing. Because that's what pack means, Luna answered gently. It means family by choice rather than blood. It means standing together against anything that threatens our own. And you, Elena, are ours now. The simple acceptance in her voice was overwhelming. Elena had spent most of her life feeling like an outsider, never quite fitting in anywhere she tried to belong. Now she was being welcomed into a family that operated on principles of loyalty and protection that went deeper than anything she'd ever experienced. I don't know how to be part of something like this, she admitted. I don't know how to be someone worth protecting or how to contribute to what you've built here. You learn, Catherine said, simply. Just like all of us did when we first found our way to this pack. None of us were born knowing how to be family to each other, Elena. We figured it out together, one day at a time. Besides, Marcus added with a grin, you've already contributed more than you realize. You've made our alpha happy for the first time in decades. That alone earns you a permanent place here. Elena glanced at Dominic, seeing the truth of Marcus's words reflected in his expression. There was a lightness to him now that hadn't been there when they'd first met, as if finding her had lifted a burden he'd been carrying for years. He makes me happy too, she said, not caring how sentimental it sounded. Good, Sarah said with satisfaction. Happy alphas make for peaceful packs. And we could all use a little more peace in our lives. The moment was interrupted by an electronic chime that made every pack member instantly alert. James moved to a bank of monitors that Elena hadn't noticed before, his fingers flying over controls with inhuman speed. "What is it?" Dominic asked, already moving toward the security station. "Council forces," James reported grimly. "3 separate groups moving through the city in coordinated search patterns. They're not just looking for Elena anymore. They're conducting a full sweep for any supernatural beings not under their direct control." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. "This is because of me, isn't it? Because they know what I am now." "This is because they're afraid," Catherine corrected. "A network seer with alpha protection represents a fundamental threat to their power structure. They're moving to consolidate control before you can fully develop your abilities." "How long do we have?" Dominic asked. 6 hours, maybe 8, before they reach this district," James answered. "But Dom, they're not just coming for Elena. Intelligence suggests they're planning to forcibly recruit or eliminate any supernatural beings who might potentially ally with us. They're escalating to open warfare," Marcus realized. "Which means we have a choice to make," Dominic said, his voice carrying the weight of command. "We can run, try to keep Elena safe until this blows over, or we can fight back, use her abilities to finally challenge the Council's authority." The room fell silent as the implications of his words sank in. Elena realized that her presence hadn't just disrupted her own life. It had forced the entire supernatural community toward a confrontation that had been brewing for decades. What would fighting back look like, she asked, needing to understand the full scope of what they were considering. "It would mean using your network sight to identify the connections that hold the Council together," Dominic explained. "Find their weaknesses, their secret alliances, the bonds they rely on to maintain power. Then we systematically dismantle their authority by exposing or severing those connections." "It would mean war," Sarah added bluntly. "Not just with the Council, but with every faction that benefits from the current power structure." "It would also mean freedom," Luna said quietly. "For all of us. The Council's control has been strangling supernatural evolution for centuries. With Elena's abilities, we could finally break free of their artificial limitations." Elena felt the weight of their expectations, the hope and fear warring in their expressions. They were asking her to choose not just her own fate, but the future of the entire supernatural world. "And if I'm not strong enough," she asked, "if I can't do what you're hoping I can do, then we adapt," Dominic said simply. "But Elena, you need to understand something. Running won't save you in the long term. The Council will never stop hunting you, and they'll use your existence as an excuse to crack down on every supernatural being who values independence. Eventually, we'll have to fight anyway. At least this way, we fight on our terms," Marcus added. "With preparation, with allies, and with the element of surprise." Elena looked around the room at faces that had become precious to her in the span of a single hour. These people were offering her not just protection but the chance to reshape the world they all lived in. The responsibility was terrifying, but the alternative, a life spent running from enemies who would never stop hunting her, was worse. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, decision crystallizing with surprising clarity. The relief that flooded through her bond with Dominic was overwhelming, followed immediately by fierce pride and protective determination. "First, we need you to map the council's power structure," Catherine said, moving to pull out charts and files that had been prepared for exactly this possibility. "Identify the key relationships, the alliances that keep them stable, the individuals whose removal would create the most disruption. Then we start cutting threads," Sarah added with predatory satisfaction. Elena studied the materials they spread before her: photographs, relationship diagrams, intelligence reports that painted a picture of supernatural politics more complex than anything she'd imagined. The council wasn't just a governing body. It was the center of a web of alliances, obligations, and secret arrangements that controlled supernatural society across multiple continents. "This is going to take time," she realized. "We have time," Dominic assured her, "and we have resources you haven't seen yet. Elena, this pack has been preparing for this kind of confrontation for decades. We're not going into this blind or unprepared." As if to prove his point, Wall's panels slid back to reveal arsenal of weapons, communications equipment, and tactical gear that transformed the comfortable living space into a command center worthy of a military operation. "How long have you been planning this?" Elena asked, awed by the scope of their preparations. "Since the day I became Alpha," Dominic admitted. "I've always known that eventually we'd have to choose between freedom and submission. I just never imagined we'd have the tool to actually win." "The tool?" "You," he said simply. "A network seer with the strength to bond with a primordial alpha. Together we're powerful enough to challenge the foundations of supernatural society itself." The magnitude of what he was describing should have been overwhelming. Instead, Elena felt a sense of rightness settle into her bones. This was what she'd been born for, what her grandmother had spent years preparing her for without either of them fully understanding it. "Then let's get started," she said, settling down at the table with the council's files spread before her. As she opened her soul sight and began to trace the golden threads that connected the supernatural world's power brokers, Elena felt her destiny clicking into place like pieces of a puzzle she'd been unconsciously assembling her entire life. The ordinary intern was gone forever. In her place sat a network seer with the power to reshape the world, surrounded by a pack willing to die for her protection and bonded to an alpha whose love burned brighter than the sun. Whatever came next, Elena knew she was exactly where she belonged. The golden threads of fate had finally brought her home. Chapter 3. The council files spread before Elena contained decades of intelligence, photographs of supernatural leaders, relationship charts, mapping alliances and entities, financial records tracking power flows through the hidden economy that existed parallel to human society. But as she reached for the first document, her fingers brushed against a silver letter opener that bore Dominic's scent, and the world exploded into visions that had nothing to do with enemy intelligence. She was in his office again, but months earlier. Through his eyes, she watched herself walk through the lobby doors for the first time, wearing a navy dress that brought out the green in her eyes. The vision Dominic stood frozen at his executive floor windows, every predatory instinct screaming that something fundamental had just changed. "Mine." The word echoed through his consciousness with such force it nearly brought him to his knees. Not a thought, but a recognition that bypassed rational understanding and struck directly at the core of his supernatural nature. Elena gasped, jerking her hand back from the letter opener as the vision dissolved. Around the table, pack members watched with expressions ranging from concerned to fascinated. "What did you see?" Catherine asked gently. "The day I started my internship," Elena said, her voice shaking. "I saw it from his perspective. Dominic, you knew what I was to you from the very first moment, didn't you?" Dominic's jaw clenched, but he didn't deny it. "Knowing and accepting are different things." "Show me more," Elena said, reaching for another object, a fountain pen she'd seen him use countless times during meetings. This time she was prepared for the onslaught of memories, but their intensity still stole her breath. She was seeing herself through his eyes over months of carefully orchestrated encounters. Dominic creating reasons to walk past her desk, timing his movements to catch glimpses of her smile when she thought no one was watching. Board meetings where he lost track of conversations because her scent drifted up from the administrative level, making his wolf pace restlessly beneath his skin. But underneath his attraction was something deeper and more troubling, a bone-deep terror that made his hands shake when he thought about claiming her. Images flashed through the shared vision. A woman with dark hair and gentle eyes, her body broken and bloodied on the floor of a room that reeked of violence and despair. "Sarah?" Elena breathed, recognizing the name from his earlier confession. "Your first mate." The pain that lanced through their bond at the mention of that name nearly doubled her over. Through the psychic connection triggered by touching his belongings, she experienced the full weight of Dominic's guilt and self-loathing. Emotions so powerful, they'd shaped every decision he'd made for over a century. "Elena, stop," he said roughly, but she was already reaching for another object, desperate to understand the trauma that had convinced him he was too dangerous to love. This time she chose a crystal paperweight that sat on his desk, something he touched daily without conscious thought. The visions that flooded her mind were darker, more violent, but also more revealing than anything she'd experienced yet. She was Dominic, but a younger version, perhaps 30 years old in apparent age, though she somehow knew he'd already been supernatural for decades. The mate bond with Sarah was new, blazing with the intensity of fresh love and desperate need. They were in a cabin somewhere remote, surrounded by the kind of wilderness that called to his wolf nature. But something was wrong. Through the vision, Elena could smell blood and fear, could hear the sounds of approaching enemies. Rogue wolves, she realized, a pack that had gone mad with power and territory lust, led by an alpha whose sanity had fractured under the weight of his own violence. Vision Dominic was fighting desperately to protect Sarah, but he was outnumbered and outmatched. She watched through his eyes as claws raked across his chest, as teeth tore into his shoulder, as the cabin filled with the sounds of supernatural combat. And then Sarah screamed. The sound shattered something fundamental in Dominic's psyche. Elena felt the exact moment his control broke, felt his wolf surge forward with such violent force that it obliterated every trace of human restraint. But the wolf's protective fury was indiscriminate, lashing out at anything that moved, anything that might represent a threat to his mate, including Sarah herself. Elena experienced the horrific moment when Dominic's claws found Sarah's throat instead of an enemy's, when his desperate need to protect became the very thing that destroyed her. The realization came too late. Sarah's life draining away in his arms, while enemies he'd been fighting retreated in terror from the monster he'd become. "Oh God," Elena gasped, tears streaming down her face as the vision released her. "Dominic, I'm so sorry. I had no idea." "Now you understand," he said, his voice carefully controlled despite the devastation she could feel through their bond. "Now you know why I can't risk letting myself love you the way you deserve." But Elena was shaking her head, reaching for yet another object despite his obvious distress. This time she chose his suit jacket, hanging over the back of his chair, something that would carry traces of more recent emotions. The visions that came were different, tinged with longing instead of trauma. She saw herself through his eyes during dozens of mundane interactions, bringing him coffee that he didn't need just for an excuse to be near her, staying late at the office to organize files that weren't her responsibility while he watched from the shadows, concerned about her walking to her car alone. Through these memories, Elena began to understand the true depth of Dominic's internal struggle. Every protective instinct screamed at him to claim her, to mark her as his, and eliminate any potential threats to her safety. But the memories of Sarah's death held him back, creating a constant war between need and terror that had been slowly driving him insane. She saw him pacing his penthouse at 3 a.m, fighting the urge to drive to her apartment just to make sure she was safe. Saw him carefully orchestrating her work assignments to keep her close without raising suspicions. Saw him memorizing every detail of her daily routine, not out of obsession but out of a desperate need to protect her from dangers she didn't even know existed. "You've been protecting me this whole time," she realized. "Even before tonight, even when you were trying to stay away from me, you were using pack resources to keep me safe." "Of course I was," he said, as if the idea of doing anything else was incomprehensible. "You're my mate, Elena. Protection doesn't require acceptance or acknowledgement. It's simply what I am to you." The matter-of-fact way he said it made her chest tight with emotion. Here was a man who'd convinced himself he was too dangerous to love, yet he'd been risking everything to keep her safe without expecting anything in return. But there was something else in the visions, something that made her reach for one more object, despite the obvious toll the psychic connection was taking on them both. She chose a small silver frame that held what looked like an old photograph, something that felt different from his other belongings, charged with older emotions and deeper significance. The vision that came wasn't of Dominic at all, but of herself as a child. Perhaps 8 years old, sitting in her grandmother's garden while the older woman told stories about creatures that lived in the shadows between worlds. But this wasn't her own memory, it was Dominic's, which should have been impossible, unless— "You knew my grandmother," she breathed, understanding flooding through her with stunning clarity. "She helped your pack before I was born." Celeste Moreau was the most gifted soul seer of her generation, Catherine said softly from across the table. "She helped us navigate some very dark times when supernatural politics nearly tore the city apart. She also saved my life," Dominic added, his voice rough with old grief. "After Sarah died, After I'd convinced myself I was too dangerous to lead a pack or maintain connections with anyone, Celeste found me. She spent months helping me understand that my loss of control wasn't a fundamental flaw in my nature. It was the result of trauma that could be healed. Elena stared at him, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed clicking into place. That's how you knew what I was before my abilities manifested. She told you about me. She told me that her granddaughter would someday possess gifts that surpassed her own, he confirmed. She also told me that when the time came, I would know her by the way her presence quieted my wolf. And does it? Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Does my presence quiet your wolf? Elena, from the moment you walked into my building, my wolf has been at peace for the first time in over a century. His eyes met hers across the table, blazing with an intensity that made her breath catch. That's how I knew, even before your abilities awakened. That's why I hired you despite having no logical reason to create an internship position. That's why I've spent 6 months fighting the strongest instinct I possess. The confession hung between them, raw and honest, and utterly devastating in its implications. Elena could feel the truth of his words through their bond, could sense the depth of his struggle to reconcile his need for her with his terror of history repeating itself. But you still believe you're dangerous to me, she said. Even knowing that I calm your wolf, even after my grandmother assured you I would be different, you're still afraid you'll lose control and hurt me, wouldn't you be? The question came out rougher than he'd probably intended. If you'd killed someone you loved with your own hands, wouldn't you be terrified of risking it again? Elena considered the question seriously, trying to imagine carrying that kind of guilt and self-doubt for over a century. The weight of it was staggering. No wonder he'd maintained such careful distance despite their obvious connection. But as she studied his face, she realized something that changed everything. The golden thread connecting them wasn't just visible through her soul sight. It was actively strengthening, growing brighter and more substantial with each moment they spent in honest communication. More than that, she could see smaller threads branching off from their main connection, weaving through his consciousness in patterns that spoke of healing rather than destruction. Dominic, she said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn, look at our bond through my sight. Really look at it. He frowned but didn't question her request, opening himself to the psychic connection between them. Elena felt the moment he perceived what she was seeing, the way their bond was actively stabilizing his supernatural nature, creating buffers and anchors that hadn't existed in his previous relationship.
That's not possible, he breathed.
It's not just possible, it's already happening, Elena said. Excitement building as she explored the phenomenon more deeply. My grandmother wasn't just telling you that I would be a powerful soul seer. She was telling you that our bond would be fundamentally different from anything you'd experienced before. How? Elena reached across the table to take his hands, marveling at how perfectly they fit together despite the obvious difference in size and strength. The moment their skin touched, she felt their connection stabilize even further, creating a supernatural equilibrium that she somehow knew would hold even under extreme stress. Because I'm not just your mate, she said, the knowledge flowing through her with absolute certainty. I'm your anchor, the psychic foundation that will keep you grounded no matter how strong your protective instincts become. Around the table, pack members watched with expressions of awe and growing hope. Catherine's eyes were bright with tears. She was clearly fighting not to shed. "Elena, dear," the older woman said gently, "do you understand what you're describing?" "I think so." Elena's voice was gaining confidence as she explored the implications of what she was sensing. Anchored bonds are supposed to be myth, aren't they? The idea that some soul seers can create psychic connections so stable they prevent supernatural partners from losing control. "They're not myth," Marcus said quietly. "They're just so rare that most people assume they're legend." The last confirmed anchored bond was over 300 years ago, and it changed the supernatural world, Sarah added. The pair who achieved it became the foundation for the first stable interspecies alliance in recorded history. Elena felt the weight of their expectations, the hope and fear warring in their expressions. They weren't just talking about her personal relationship with Dominic. They were discussing the potential for a bond that could reshape supernatural politics on a global scale. But to create an anchored bond, Catherine continued carefully, both partners have to be willing to surrender complete emotional and psychic control to each other. There can be no barriers, no held-back pieces, no protection of vulnerabilities. It requires a level of trust that most beings, supernatural or human, are simply incapable of achieving. The magnitude of what they were describing sent a shiver through Elena. Complete surrender wasn't just about physical intimacy or emotional honesty. It was about allowing another person access to every thought, every fear, every shameful secret that defined her innermost self. "And if we tried and failed?" she asked. "The psychic backlash would destroy you both," James said bluntly. "Anchored bonds aren't something you experiment with, Elena. Either you achieve perfect synchronization or you die in the attempt." The stark warning should have been enough to kill any romantic notions about mystical connections and destined love. Instead, Elena found herself studying Dominic's face, searching for any sign that he was as terrified by the possibility as she should be. What she saw there stole her breath. Hope. Desperate, carefully hidden hope that he was clearly fighting not to acknowledge even to himself. "You want to try," she realized. "Elena." "No, don't deny it. I can see it in your eyes. I can feel it through our bond." She leaned closer, drawn by the vulnerability he was trying so hard to hide. "You want to try creating an anchored bond with me. What I want and what's safe are two entirely different things," he said roughly. "Elena, if we attempted something like that and failed." "We won't fail." The certainty in her own voice surprised her, but as soon as she spoke the words, she knew they were true. "Dominic, look at what's already happening between us. Look at how our connection has been growing stronger instead of more volatile. This isn't coincidence or wishful thinking. This is what we're meant to become." "You can't know that." "Yes, I can." She tightened her grip on his hands, letting her soul sight expand until it encompassed not just their current bond, but the potential it represented. "I can see the pattern, Dominic. The way our energies complement each other, the spaces where your vulnerabilities align with my strengths and vice versa. We're not just compatible, we're specifically designed to complete each other." The vision that came as she spoke was unlike anything she'd experienced yet. Instead of memories or current emotional states, she was seeing possibilities, potential futures that branched out from this moment, like golden roads stretching into infinity. In one future, they achieved the anchored bond and became the foundation for a new supernatural order built on cooperation rather than domination. In another, they failed to trust each other completely and died in each other's arms as their psychic connection tore itself apart. But running through every possibility was a single constant, the love between them burning bright enough to reshape reality itself. Elena, Dominic's voice was barely a whisper. "What are you seeing?" "US," she said simply. "Every possible version of us. And Dominic, in every future where we survive, in every timeline where we're together, we change." She could feel the pack's tension, their awareness that they were witnessing something unprecedented. But Elena's attention was focused entirely on the man across from her, on the way his carefully controlled expression was beginning to crack under the weight of possibility. "Show me," he said finally, and the vulnerability in his voice was devastating. Elena didn't question what he meant. Opening their psychic connection as wide as she could manage, she shared the visions flowing through her consciousness, futures where their bond became the foundation for peace between supernatural factions, where their combined abilities created sanctuaries for beings who'd never known safety, where their love literally rewrote the laws governing supernatural society. The flood of images was overwhelming, but through it all ran a single thread of truth. They were meant for this. Whatever cosmic forces had brought them together, whatever ancient bloodlines had converged in their genetics, everything had been building toward this moment. When the visions finally faded, Dominic was staring at her with an expression she'd never seen before. Complete, unguarded wonder. "You really believe we can do this?" he said. "I don't just believe it," Elena replied. "I can see it happening. Our bond is already deeper than anything you experienced with Sarah, more stable than most supernatural connections ever become. We're not starting from nothing, Dominic. We're building on a foundation that's already stronger than anything the Council or their enemies can break." Around the table, pack members were exchanging glances filled with excitement and carefully suppressed hope. Elena realized that this moment was about more than just her relationship with Dominic. It was about the possibility of fundamental change in a world that had been locked in the same patterns of conflict for centuries. "There's something else," Catherine said softly. "Something you both need to understand before you make any decisions about attempting an anchored bond." The seriousness in her tone drew everyone's attention. Elena felt a chill of premonition, sensing that whatever Catherine was about to reveal would complicate their situation in ways she couldn't yet imagine. "What is it?" Dominic asked, though his voice suggested he might already suspect. "Elena, dear, your parents weren't just soul seers," Catherine said gently. "They were attempting to create an anchored bond when they were killed." The words hit Elena like a physical blow. She'd known her parents died under suspicious circumstances, had felt the truth of their murder in the visions triggered by touching Dominic's belongings. But the idea that they'd been killed specifically because they were trying to achieve the same connection she and Dominic were discussing made their deaths infinitely more personal. "Who killed them?" she asked, surprised by how calm her voice sounded, despite the rage building in her chest. "A council strike team," Marcus answered grimly. led by a man named Victor Thorne, who's currently the Council's chief enforcer for supernatural stability. They were seen as too dangerous to allow their bond to complete, Sarah added. The Council had intelligence suggesting that an anchored bond between two powerful soul seers would create a psychic resonance capable of destabilizing their entire power structure. Elena felt pieces clicking into place with devastating clarity. That's why they're so afraid of me. It's not just that I'm a network seer, it's that I have the genetic potential to create the same kind of bond that terrified them enough to commit murder. And now you're bonding with a primordial alpha instead of another seer, James said quietly. Which makes you potentially even more dangerous to their established order. The implications were staggering. Elena wasn't just inheriting her parents' abilities, she was walking directly into the crosshairs of the people who'd had them killed. The Council wouldn't just want to capture or control her, they'd want to eliminate her before she could complete the very bond that had cost her parents their lives. They'll never stop hunting us, she realized. No, Dominic agreed, his voice hard with deadly determination. Which is why we're going to make sure they never get the chance. The predatory edge in his tone sent heat spiraling through Elena's belly, despite the gravity of their situation. There was something primitively satisfying about having a mate who responded to threats against her with such violent protectiveness. You're talking about war, Catherine said, though her voice held approval rather than concern. I'm talking about justice, Dominic corrected. Elena's parents were murdered for the crime of loving each other. How many others have suffered the same fate? How many potential anchored bonds have been destroyed because the Council fears what they might represent? It's not just about anchored bonds, Elena said, understanding flooding through her as she accessed memories that felt like her grandmother's legacy flowing through her bloodline. It's about evolution. The Council has been artificially constraining supernatural development for centuries, preventing the kinds of connections and abilities that could fundamentally change our species. She was seeing it now through her expanded network site, the web of control and manipulation that kept supernatural society locked in patterns of conflict and competition. The Council didn't just govern, they actively prevented the kind of cooperation and connection that could render their authority obsolete. They're not protectors, she breathed. They're parasites. They maintain power by keeping everyone else weak and divided. And now they know that power is threatened by what you represent, Marcus said. Elena, you're not just a network seer capable of exposing their manipulations, you're the living embodiment of everything they've spent centuries trying to prevent. The weight of responsibility was overwhelming. Elena had gone from being an ordinary intern to being the focal point of a supernatural revolution in the span of a single evening. The scope of what was being asked of her should have sent her running for the nearest exit. Instead, she found herself looking around the table at faces that had become precious to her in just a few hours, thinking about all the supernatural beings who'd lived their entire existence under the Council's oppressive control. Remembering parents she'd never truly known who died for the crime of loving each other. Then we give them something to really be afraid of, she said. Decision crystallizing with startling clarity. Dominic's eyes blazed with pride and fierce approval. Elena? No. Listen to me. All of you. She stood, feeling power flow through her with each word. They killed my parents because they were afraid of what an anchored bond might represent. They're hunting me because they know I have the potential to expose their manipulations and create the very connections they've spent centuries preventing. She moved around the table, letting her soul sight expand until she could perceive the supernatural ecosystem of the entire city. Thousands of beings living in fear, isolation, and artificial constraint. But what if we gave them what they're really afraid of? Elena continued, excitement building as the full scope of possibility became clear. Not just one anchored bond, but a network of them. Not just exposure of their corruption, but an alternative power structure built on genuine connection and mutual support. You're talking about revolution, Sarah said, admiration clear in her voice. I'm talking about evolution, Elena corrected. The natural development that should have happened centuries ago if the council hadn't been artificially constraining it. She could see it now, not just in visions of possible futures, but as a concrete plan taking shape in her mind. Her network sight wasn't just useful for exposing enemy weaknesses. It could identify potential bonds between beings who'd never realized their compatibility, facilitate connections that could create a supernatural society built on cooperation rather than domination. The anchored bond between Dominic and me would just be the beginning, she explained, moving back to stand beside his chair. Once we establish that foundation, we can use it to help others find their own connections, their own sources of strength and stability. And what happens when the council realizes what you're doing? Catherine asked, though her tone suggested she already supported the plan despite its obvious dangers. Then we make sure we're strong enough to defend what we've built, Dominic said, rising to stand beside Elena with predatory grace. My pack has been preparing for this confrontation for decades. We have allies, resources, and now we have the one thing we've been missing, a reason to believe we can actually win. Elena felt the truth of his words through their bond, felt his fierce pride in her courage and his absolute determination to protect what they were building together. But more than that, she felt the pack's growing excitement, their recognition that they were witnessing the birth of something unprecedented. There's something else, she said, another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. My parents' research. If they were attempting an anchored bond, they would have documented their progress, their techniques, their understanding of how such connections work. Where would they have kept such documentation? James asked, immediately understanding the implications. My grandmother's house, Elena realized. She inherited everything after they died, and she was too smart to destroy knowledge that might someday be crucial for my survival. Research that could give us the foundation we need to succeed where your parents were murdered before they could complete their bond. Marcus said with growing excitement. It's a 6-hour drive to the bayou, Sarah calculated. We could retrieve whatever's there and be back before the council forces reach this district. Assuming the house hasn't been compromised, Dominic pointed out, though Elena could feel his eagerness to pursue this lead through their connection. It won't be, Elena said, with certainty that surprised her. My grandmother was too paranoid and too powerful to leave her sanctuary unprotected. If there's documentation of my parents' research anywhere, it's safe in her house. The plan was taking shape with startling speed, driven by a combination of desperate necessity and genuine hope. Elena could see the possibilities branching out before them, not just their own survival, but the foundation for fundamental change in supernatural society. Then we have our next move, Dominic said, his voice carrying the authority of an alpha who'd made his decision. Elena and I retrieve her parents' research while the pack prepares defenses here. We use that knowledge to complete our anchored bond, then begin building the network of connections that will make the Council's authority obsolete. And if they try to stop us? Adrian asked, though his tone suggested he was hoping they would. Then they discover why my pack has maintained independence for over a century, Dominic replied, and his smile was sharp enough to cut glass. And why Elena Moreau is going to become the most dangerous supernatural being they've ever encountered. Elena felt a thrill of anticipation and terror at his words. She was committing to a path that would transform not just her own existence, but potentially the entire supernatural world. The responsibility was staggering. The dangers were real, and the likelihood of survival seemed impossibly small. But as she looked around the table at faces that radiated fierce loyalty and carefully suppressed hope, as she felt the strength of her bond with Dominic blazing between them like a beacon, Elena knew she was exactly where she belonged. "When do we leave?" she asked. "Now," Dominic said, already moving toward the weapons cabinet. "Every hour we delay gives the Council more time to consolidate their forces and eliminate our potential allies. The others will stay here and begin preparing for whatever comes next," Catherine added, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions. "Elena, dear, there are things you'll need to know about navigating your grandmother's protections." What followed was a crash course in supernatural security measures that made Elena's head spin. Her grandmother hadn't just been a powerful soul seer. She'd been a paranoid one, surrounding her bayou sanctuary with layers of mystical defenses, designed to keep out anyone with hostile intentions. "The wards will recognize your bloodline," Catherine explained, "but they might not initially accept Dominic's presence. You'll need to actively invite him through each barrier, consciously extending your protection to include him." "What happens if I don't do it correctly?" "Best case scenario, he'll be unable to enter the property," Sarah said grimly. "Worst case, the defensive measures will treat him as a threat and respond accordingly." Elena felt a chill at the implications. Her grandmother's protections were designed to eliminate supernatural predators, and Dominic definitely qualified as one of the most dangerous examples of the breed. "I won't let anything happen to you," she told him, surprised by the fierce protectiveness in her own voice. "I know," he replied simply, and the absolute trust in his tone made her chest tight with emotion. "Besides," Marcus added with a grin, "if anyone can convince ancient magical defenses to accept a Primordial Alpha, it's his anchored mate." The casual way he referred to their bond as if it was already established sent warmth flooding through Elena's chest. These people weren't just hoping she and Dominic would succeed. They were acting as if their success was inevitable. "Time to go," Dominic said, checking the weapons he'd secured at various points on his body. "Elena, are you ready for this?" She thought about everything that had happened in the past few hours, everything she was leaving behind, everything she was choosing to embrace. The magnitude of the change was staggering, but the rightness of it settled into her bones, like coming home. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it completely. The drive through the city revealed the extent of council activity. Elena hadn't realized was happening. Through her expanded soul sight, she could see supernatural beings moving through the shadows with military precision, conducting what could only be described as a coordinated sweep operation. They're not just looking for us, she realized, watching golden threads of fear and coercion stretching between the figures in her vision. They're rounding up anyone who might potentially ally with us. Mass recruitment, Dominic said grimly, navigating through streets that appeared normal to human observation but were crawling with supernatural activity. Offer supernatural beings the choice between joining council forces or being eliminated as potential threats. How many will resist? Not enough. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. Most supernatural beings have spent their entire existence avoiding council attention. The idea of open resistance will terrify them more than the idea of forced compliance. Elena felt a surge of sadness for beings trapped between impossible choices, but also a renewed determination to create alternatives. The network of connections she was envisioning wouldn't just be about power or revolution. It would be about offering sanctuary to those who'd never known true safety. "We'll give them something worth fighting for," she said. "We will," Dominic agreed, and through their bond she felt his absolute faith in their eventual success. The drive to her grandmother's house took them deep into Louisiana Bayou country, through landscapes that seemed increasingly removed from the modern world with each passing mile. Elena had always loved visiting Grandmare's sanctuary, but she'd never realized how perfectly designed it was for concealing supernatural activity. "Your grandmother chose this location carefully," Dominic observed as they turned onto the final stretch of road leading to the property. "The natural geography creates a maze that would confuse and disorient anyone unfamiliar with the area, and the local ecosystem would mask supernatural scents and energy signatures," Elena added, understanding dawning as she applied her new knowledge to childhood memories. She wasn't just hiding from human attention, she was creating a sanctuary that could conceal supernatural refugees. The house came into view as they rounded the final curve, a sprawling Creole cottage that had been in Elena's family for generations, surrounded by ancient cypress trees, draped in Spanish moss. But as they approached, Elena's soul sight revealed the true extent of her grandmother's preparations. Golden threads of protective energy surrounded the entire property, woven into patterns so complex they made her eyes water to follow. Layer upon layer of defensive measures, some clearly designed to repel specific types of supernatural threats, others apparently created to hide the property from mystical detection entirely. "My God," she breathed. "How long did it take her to create all this?" "Decades," Dominic said with obvious respect. "Elena, your grandmother wasn't just powerful. She was one of the most sophisticated magical architects I've ever encountered." The car stopped at what appeared to be an empty stretch of road, but Elena could see the first barrier shimmering just ahead of them, a wall of protective energy that would be invisible to anyone without supernatural sight. "This is where we find out if the wards will accept our bond," she said, stepping out of the car and immediately feeling the weight of ancient protections pressing against her consciousness. The moment her feet touched the ground, the defensive measures came alive. Elena felt them probing her identity, her intentions, her genetic heritage. But they also sensed Dominic's presence, and she could feel their hostile assessment of a powerful predator approaching protected territory. "Take my hand," she told him, extending her awareness toward the barrier that blocked their path. "Let me show them that you're not a threat." The instant their skin touched, Elena felt their bond blaze brighter, creating a connection so strong it was visible even to the ancient wards. But more than that, she felt her grandmother's presence within the protective measures, not just energy patterns, but actual consciousness that had been woven into the defenses. "Ma petite," her grandmother's voice whispered through her awareness, warm with love and approval. "You've found him, the one whose darkness will balance your light." "Grandmère," Elena whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You're here, part of me, yes, enough to help you understand what your parents discovered, enough to guide you through what comes next." The presence in the wards shifted, extending mystical welcome toward Dominic. "Come home, both of you. There is much you need to know and little time to learn it." The barriers parted like curtains, revealing a path that led through increasingly dense vegetation toward the house itself. But as they walked, Elena realized that the property was far larger than she'd ever suspected as a child. Her grandmother's protections enclosed several acres of bayou wilderness that could easily hide a small supernatural community. She was preparing for refugees, Elena realized. All of this, the protections, the hidden spaces, the mystical concealment, she was creating a sanctuary for supernatural beings fleeing council persecution. "And now it's yours," Dominic said, wonder clear in his voice as he surveyed the scope of what they'd inherited. "Elena, do you understand what this represents? This is more than just a safe house. It's the foundation for the alternative power structure you were envisioning." The house itself was exactly as Elena remembered, but viewed through her awakened senses, it revealed secrets she'd never suspected. Every room had been designed with supernatural considerations in mind. Reinforced construction that could contain shapeshifter transformations, mystical shielding that would prevent psychic detection, hidden passages that could provide escape routes during emergencies. "Your parents' research," her grandmother's presence whispered as they entered the main living area. "In the room that was once your nursery. I've kept it safe, waiting for the day you would need it." Elena led Dominic up the narrow staircase to what had indeed been her childhood bedroom during summer visits. But when she opened the door, she discovered a space that had been completely transformed into a research library that would have impressed university scholars. Books, journals, charts, and diagrams covered every available surface. But more than that, Elena could see traces of psychic energy clinging to the materials. Evidence that her parents had been experimenting with techniques for documenting and analyzing supernatural bonds in ways that went far beyond traditional academic research. They weren't just studying anchored bonds, Dominic said, moving to examine a chart that mapped relationship dynamics between different supernatural species. They were developing methodologies for creating and stabilizing connections across the entire spectrum of supernatural society. Elena picked up a leather-bound journal that radiated her mother's psychic signature, immediately overwhelmed by visions of a woman who looked remarkably like her, but possessed a confidence and power that Elena could only hope to achieve. Through the psychic imprint left in the journal, she experienced her parents' work, From their perspective, months of careful experimentation, gradual development of techniques that pushed the boundaries of what soul seers were supposed to be capable of achieving. They discovered something, she said. Excitement building as she absorbed information that felt like genetic memory awakening, a way to create not just anchored bonds, but network anchors, connections that could stabilize entire communities of supernatural beings. Network anchors? Dominic moved to read over her shoulder, his presence immediately calming the overwhelming flow of psychic information. Instead of just two individuals creating an unbreakable bond, they found a way to extend that stability to include multiple connections simultaneously. Elena turned pages filled with diagrams that showed relationship networks of unprecedented complexity. A mated pair with a strong enough foundation could become the center of a web of stabilized connections, each one reinforcing the others. The implications were staggering. What her parents had discovered wasn't just a technique for strengthening individual relationships. It was a method for creating supernatural communities that could operate as unified entities while maintaining individual autonomy. They were going to revolutionize supernatural society, Dominic realized. They were going to make the council obsolete, Elena corrected, understanding flowing through her with crystal clarity. A network of anchored connections wouldn't need external governance or artificial constraint. It would be naturally stable, self-regulating, and completely resistant to the kind of manipulation the council uses to maintain power. Which is why they were killed before they could complete their own bond, Dominic said grimly. The council couldn't risk letting them succeed. Elena continued reading, absorbing techniques and theories that felt like recovering lost pieces of her own identity. Her parents hadn't just been researchers, they'd been visionaries whose work could have transformed the supernatural world if they'd lived long enough to implement it. But they'd also been careful to document their failures and concerns along with their successes. As Elena read deeper into their research, she discovered warnings that made her blood run cold. Network anchoring isn't without risks, she said, sharing her growing understanding with Dominic through their bond. If the central anchor point fails, if the primary mated pair is destroyed or corrupted, the entire network can collapse in ways that are psychically catastrophic for everyone connected. Meaning what exactly? Meaning that everyone linked to a failed network anchor doesn't just lose their connections, they lose the ability to form supernatural bonds entirely. Elena's voice was quiet with the horror of what she was reading. They become completely isolated, cut off from the very relationships that define supernatural existence. The magnitude of responsibility was overwhelming. If she and Dominic attempted to become a network anchor and failed, they wouldn't just destroy themselves, they could psychically cripple every supernatural being who trusted them enough to form connections through their bond. That's why the council is so determined to stop us, Dominic said, understanding the political implications with frightening clarity. If we succeed, we could create an alternative power structure that makes their authority irrelevant. But if we fail catastrophically, we could damage the supernatural community so severely that they'd become completely dependent on council control. Either we save everyone, or we damn them all, Elena summarized. No pressure, Dominic said with dark humor, though she could feel his genuine concern through their bond. Elena continued reading, searching for guidance that might tip the scales in favor of success rather than catastrophic failure. Her parents had been methodical researchers, documenting not just their theoretical discoveries, but their practical attempts to implement those theories. "There's something else," she said, finding a section of her mother's journal that made her heart race with excitement and terror. They didn't just theorize about network anchoring, they actually achieved it. "What?" "For 3 weeks before their deaths, my parents successfully maintained a network anchor that included 17 supernatural beings across 4 different species." Elena's voice was shaking as she read the documentation of her parents' achievement. "They proved it could work, Dominic. They proved it was stable and beneficial for everyone involved." "What happened to the network when they died?" Elena's eyes filled with tears as she read the final entries in her mother's journal. Increasingly desperate notes about council surveillance, fears that their success had been discovered, contingency plans for protecting their research and their unborn daughter. "The network collapsed when they were killed," she said quietly, "but not catastrophically. My mother had enough warning to gradually dissolve the connections before the assassination, saving the other participants from psychic damage." "Meaning she died protecting others even when she knew her own death was imminent," Dominic said with obvious respect. "She died protecting me," Elena corrected, finding the final entry that made everything clear. The council didn't just kill them to prevent their success, they killed them because my mother was pregnant with a child who would inherit network anchoring abilities that surpassed both parents. The knowledge settled into her consciousness, like pieces of a puzzle she'd been unconsciously assembling her entire life. She wasn't just her parents' daughter, she was the culmination of their research, the living embodiment of everything they dreamed of achieving. "Elena," Dominic said softly, his voice thick with emotion, "do you understand what this means?" "It means I don't have to figure out how to create a network anchor from scratch," she said, wonder and terror warring in her chest. "The ability is already part of my genetic heritage. I just need to learn how to access it safely. And I need to learn how to support it without destabilizing the very thing we're trying to build," Dominic added. Elena turned to find him studying a different section of her parents' research, notes about the requirements for successful anchoring partnerships. His expression was thoughtful but also deeply concerned. "What is it?" she asked. "Your parents documented specific criteria for supernatural partners capable of supporting network anchors," he said, showing her charts that mapped power dynamics between different types of supernatural beings. "According to their research, it requires not just emotional and psychic compatibility, but perfectly balanced supernatural abilities." Eleni studied the charts, seeing immediately what concerned him. The power requirements for network anchoring were staggering. It took 2 exceptionally strong supernatural beings working in perfect harmony to create and maintain the kind of connections her parents had achieved. "Do we meet the criteria?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "On paper, yes." His voice was carefully controlled. A fully mature network seer bonded with a primordial alpha should theoretically be capable of supporting connections for up to 40 supernatural beings simultaneously. But I'm not fully in control of my abilities yet," he admitted with obvious frustration. "Elena, I've spent over a century suppressing my true power levels because they were too dangerous to maintain around others. Learning to access that strength safely, learning to channel it in ways that support rather than overwhelm our bond. That's going to take time we don't have. The complexity of their situation was becoming clear with devastating precision. They had the knowledge, the genetic heritage, and the theoretical compatibility to achieve something unprecedented in supernatural history. But they also had enemies closing in, abilities that weren't fully developed, and the kind of time pressure that made careful preparation. Then we improvise, Elena said, surprising herself with the confidence in her voice. My parents spent months developing their techniques gradually. We don't have that luxury, but we have something they didn't, which is their research. She gestured to the room full of documentation surrounding them. We don't have to figure out everything from scratch. We have their entire methodology documented here, plus whatever wisdom my grandmother embedded in the property's protections. And, Dominic added, understanding beginning to dawn in his expression, we have a mating bond that's already stronger than anything your parents achieved before their deaths. Elena felt the truth of his words through their connection. The golden thread binding them had been growing steadily stronger throughout the evening, reaching levels of intensity that her parents' research suggested shouldn't have been possible so quickly. We're not starting from nothing, she realized. We're building on a foundation that's already more stable than what my parents had when they began their network experiments. Which means we might be able to compress months of gradual development into a much shorter time frame, Dominic said, excitement beginning to build in his voice. It also means we're risking everything on an accelerated timeline with no safety net. Elena pointed out, though she could feel her own excitement matching his, despite the obvious dangers. Elena. Dominic moved to frame her face with his hands, his touch immediately steadying the chaos of possibility and fear warring in her chest. I need you to understand something before we go any further with this. What if we attempt network anchoring and succeed? There's no going back, ever. We'll be bound together in ways that transcend death itself, and will be responsible for the psychic stability of every supernatural being who chooses to connect through our bond. His eyes blazed with intensity that made her breath catch. Are you prepared for that level of commitment, that level of responsibility? The magnitude of what he was asking should have been terrifying. Complete commitment to a man she'd known for hours, responsibility for potentially dozens of supernatural beings she'd never met, transformation into something that existed beyond the normal boundaries of individual existence. Instead, Elena felt a sense of rightness settle into her bones that was deeper than fear, stronger than doubt. Dominic, she said, meeting his gaze with absolute certainty. I've been preparing for this my entire life without knowing it. Every instinct I've ever ignored, every strange feeling I've dismissed, every moment when I felt like I didn't quite belong in the normal world, it was all leading to this. And if we fail, if we destroy ourselves and everyone who trusts us, then we fail together, she said simply. But we won't fail, because failure isn't an option when the alternative is letting the council continue destroying people like my parents. The kiss that followed was different from any they'd shared before. Not desperate or exploratory, but sealing. A promise made flesh. a commitment that transcended words and touched something fundamental in both their souls. When they broke apart, Elena could feel their bond crystallizing into something that felt permanent, unbreakable, ready to serve as the foundation for everything they were about to attempt. "Are you ready to change the world?" Dominic asked, his voice rough with emotion and anticipation. "With you?" Elena smiled, feeling power flow through her that was both hers and his, and somehow more than either could achieve alone. "I'm ready for anything." Outside, thunder rumbled across the bayou as ancient protections responded to the power building between them. Whatever came next, whatever enemies they faced or challenges they had to overcome, Elena knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. In Dominic's arms, surrounded by her parents' legacy, protected by her grandmother's love, and on the verge of becoming something that could reshape the supernatural world forever. The golden threads of fate had finally brought her home.